Zohran Mamdani saw Muslim twins abandoned on the street. What he did next shocked everyone. We have a dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers by the end of this month. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and become part of our dream too. The sun had barely risen over Queens when Zohran Mamdani walked out of his apartment, his coat buttoned tight against the sharp November wind. The city was already awake, buses coughing smoke, vendors setting up carts, and the hum of people rushing toward somewhere important. To Zohran, this noise was the heartbeat of a place he had sworn to serve. Every morning, before heading to the assembly, he walked the same route to the subway station. It wasn't a grand ritual, but it reminded him why he fought so hard, not for headlines, but for the people whose names the world would never know. He often smiled to himself, thinking how strange it was that the son of Ugandan refugees now helped write laws for one of the world's most powerful cities. As he passed under the worn awning of a halal bakery, he greeted the owner, an old man named Rashid, who always insisted Zohran take a warm samosa for energy. This morning, though, the politician felt a heaviness he couldn't name. The air carried something unsettled, a silence that didn't belong in Astoria's usual chaos. Across the street, a group of commuters waited for the light to change, but a small shape near the corner caught his attention. Two small shapes, actually. They sat close together, wrapped in oversized coats, their faces hidden under scarves. For a second, Zohran thought they were just neighborhood kids playing before school. But when one lifted her head, he saw fear instead of playfulness. He crossed the street without thinking. "Hey there," he said softly, crouching down so he wouldn't tower over them. The twins, a boy and a girl, maybe 6 or 7, didn't answer. Their eyes darted between him and the passing cars. They looked exhausted, cheeks streaked with cold tears. On the ground beside them sat a small plastic bag with a folded Quran and a pair of torn shoes inside. "Are you lost?" he asked again. The girl clutched her brother's hand tighter. Then, almost whispering, she said, "Mama said she'd come back." The words hit Zohran like a punch to the chest. His breath clouded in the air, and for the first time that morning, the city's noise faded into nothingness. He glanced around, searching for an adult, a sign, a clue, but there was no one. Just the wind tugging at the edge of the girl's scarf and the faint sound of the adhan echoing from a distant mosque. In that fragile silence, something inside him shifted. He wasn't just a politician now, he was a man standing before two children who had nothing left but faith and confusion. He looked down at the Quran in the bag, then at their shivering hands. "It's all right," he murmured, taking off his own coat and wrapping it around them. "You're safe now." And though he couldn't have known it then, that single act, a coat, a promise, a decision, would set in motion a chain of events that would test his beliefs, challenge his heart, and move an entire nation to tears. The morning crowd swirled around them like a restless tide as Zohran led the twins toward the small cafe near the subway station. The boy's steps were hesitant, his sister clinging to his sleeve, both trembling more from uncertainty than from cold. Inside, the warmth and smell of coffee met them like a gentle embrace. Zohran guided them to a corner booth and waved to the barista, a young woman who immediately recognized him. "Assemblyman Mamdani," she said brightly, but her smile faded when she saw the children. "Hot chocolate, please," he said, his voice low. "2 cups, extra warm." When the drinks arrived, he finally asked their names. The boy's voice was barely audible. "Amir," he said. His sister followed softly, "Aya." The syllables carried something sacred, names once spoken by a mother now gone. As they sipped the hot chocolate, their small fingers wrapped around the cups as if holding on to the only warmth left in the world. "Do you know where your mama went?" Zohran asked gently. Aya shook her head. "She said she was going to get food. But she didn't come back." Amir looked at the floor, as though saying the words aloud might make them true. A waitress approached, curious, whispering to another employee, and soon the quiet cafe was full of eyes that watched but didn't act. Zohran felt the sting of that silence, how quickly compassion turns into hesitation when people fear involvement. He knew it too well from his work, laws could change, but hearts took longer. Pulling out his phone, he called the nearest shelter that worked with displaced families. As he spoke, Aya tugged at his sleeve. "Are you police?" she asked. Zohran paused, smiled faintly. "No, little one. I'm just someone who wants to help." Her eyes steadied him for a long moment, as if measuring his soul, before she nodded and whispered, "Mama said Allah sends people." Outside, a small group of neighbors had gathered, drawn by rumor and curiosity. Rashid, the baker, appeared too, carrying 2 freshly wrapped pastries. "Children on the street," he muttered, handing the food to Zohran. "This city forgets the poor too easily." The words sank deep. For the first time that day, Zohran wasn't sure if this was only an act of kindness, or a call. As he looked at the twins, he felt a quiet conviction growing inside him. These children were not just victims of circumstance, they were mirrors of a world that had lost its empathy. And somewhere beyond that cafe window, he sensed that the story had only begun, a story that would demand more of him than any speech or law ever had. The calm inside the cafe didn't last long. The sound of sirens broke through the quiet hum of conversation, a sharp reminder that the world outside still moved at its relentless pace. Zohran glanced through the window as a police cruiser stopped across the street. 2 officers stepped out, adjusting their belts, scanning the area. The cafe owner, uneasy, whispered, "Someone must have called them." A few customers looked away, others pretended not to notice. Zohran's pulse quickened. He knew how stories like this too often ended, children mistaken for runaways, families lost in bureaucratic mazes. He rose from his seat as the officers entered, the metallic jingle of the door slicing the silence. "Good morning, gentlemen," Zohran began, his tone calm but firm. "Can I help you?" One officer, a tall man with an authoritative posture, nodded toward the twins. "We got a report about 2 unattended minors. Need to take them in for questioning." Aya froze, clutching her brother's arm. Amir's eyes filled with panic. "It's okay," Zohran whispered, kneeling beside them. "No one's taking you anywhere without me." The officers exchanged glances, they recognized the man now standing before them. Assemblyman Mamdani, the shorter one muttered, suddenly cautious. "Yes," Zohran replied. "And those children are under my care until we find their mother." His voice was steady, but his heart pounded with quiet fury at how fragile their safety was. The taller officer hesitated, lowering his radio. "Sir, with respect, we still have procedures," Zohran interrupted softly, "procedures that often forget compassion. Let's not make this one of those stories." He didn't raise his voice, he didn't have to. Authority radiated from his calm conviction. After a tense pause, the officers stepped aside. One of them even offered to notify child services while allowing Zohran to accompany them. He nodded in gratitude, though his chest tightened at the thought of the system swallowing these children whole. As the officers left, the cafe's customers exhaled collectively, as if emerging from an unseen tension. Aya reached for Zohran's hand, whispering, "You didn't let them take us." In that instant, something shifted deep within him, a realization that his role as a public servant wasn't confined to speeches or votes. It was this, the courage to stand between power and the powerless. When the police car pulled away, Zohran sat back down, exhaustion mixing with resolve. "We'll find your mother," he promised. Amir's small voice trembled. "And if she doesn't come back?" Zohran looked at them both, the city's reflection glimmering in the cafe window behind him. "Then you'll never be alone again," he said quietly. The promise hung in the air like a vow, one that would soon test everything he believed about faith, responsibility, and what it truly means to serve. The day had stretched long into the gray edges of evening by the time Zohran returned to his small office in Astoria. The twins followed close behind, their small shadows moving hesitantly through the dim hallway lined with campaign posters and stacks of policy papers. He had spoken with every shelter, mosque, and community center he could reach, yet no one had reported missing children matching their description. Aya had fallen asleep on one of the chairs, her head resting on her brother's lap. Amir stared at the window, silent and awake. The hum of distant traffic filled the silence. Zohran leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. For the first time in years, the politician felt helpless. The city that had answers for everything had none for two small children. His phone buzzed, a call from a city official. "Assemblyman Mamdani, we appreciate your concern," the woman said with bureaucratic politeness. "But it's best to let child services handle this. It's not your responsibility." The word struck him harder than she intended. Not your responsibility. He glanced at the twins again. How easy it was for the system to speak in circles while humanity slipped through the cracks. With respect, he replied, "I was elected to protect people, not paperwork." The line went silent. When he hung up, he realized he had crossed an invisible line between public duty and personal conviction. He didn't care. Some moments demanded heart, not protocol. He stood, walking toward the window. Outside, the neon signs of late-night shops painted streaks of red and blue across the street. For a brief second, he remembered his own childhood stories, his parents' exile from Uganda, the fear of being abandoned in a strange land. Maybe that was why the sight of the twins had pierced him so deeply. They were echoes of his own past, reminders that kindness was not a political act but a spiritual one. Behind him, Amir whispered, "Are we going to a new house?" Zohran turned, kneeling before him. "No, you're staying here tonight," he said softly. "This is your home for now." Aya stirred, blinking sleepily, her voice barely above a breath. "Will Mama find us?" Zohran hesitated. Then he reached out, tucking a blanket around her. "If she can't," he said, his throat tightening, "then I'll make sure she'd be proud of who finds you." The children closed their eyes, and for a fleeting moment, the world outside seemed to pause, as if time itself respected the quiet weight of his promise. That night, as the city lights flickered through the blinds, Zohran knew his life had irrevocably changed. He was no longer just an assemblyman, he had become the guardian of two souls who had turned his sense of duty into something far deeper, purpose. Morning sunlight crept through the blinds of Zohran's office, painting long lines across the sleeping twins. He had spent the night drafting letters, emails, and official requests, each one a desperate attempt to move the city's machinery with compassion instead of protocol. The coffee on his desk had gone cold, but his resolve burned steady. When the children awoke, he smiled wearily. "Today," he said, "we're going to find your mother." Their eyes lit up, a fragile hope flickering inside them. Before leaving, he wrapped scarves around their necks, the same way his mother used to when he was their age. That small act reminded him how love was built not from grand gestures, but from consistency, from showing up when no one else did. At City Hall, however, consistency met concrete. His first meeting was with the Department of Child Services, a sterile room, fluorescent lights, and voices that sounded more mechanical than human. "Mr. Mamdani," one official began, adjusting his glasses, "we appreciate your involvement, but you've overstepped. You can't just house minors without authorization." Zohran leaned forward, his tone respectful but unwavering. "Then authorize me," he said. "They're scared, hungry, and they trust me. Isn't that what matters most right now?" The official sighed. "This isn't about trust, Assemblyman. It's about procedure." The room fell silent. For the first time in his political career, Zohran felt what so many of his constituents must have felt, the suffocating frustration of bureaucracy crushing humanity. As he walked out, a journalist waiting by the steps snapped photos. "Assemblyman Mamdani, is it true you're sheltering abandoned children in your office?" she asked, microphone outstretched. The question spread like wildfire. By the time he reached his car, social media was already ablaze with speculation. Some praised his courage, others accused him of exploiting the situation for publicity. The weight of misunderstanding pressed on him, but he didn't let it show. In the rearview mirror, he saw the twins sitting quietly in the back seat, sharing a piece of bread Rashid had packed that morning. Their innocence silenced every doubt. The truth didn't need defending, it needed living. That night, exhausted yet unyielding, Zohran stood before a small gathering at the local mosque. He told the imam and the congregation what he'd seen, what he'd felt. Faith, he said, is not belief in comfort, it's belief in responsibility. The room fell into reflective silence. The imam placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered, "You are doing what prophets did, protecting those who cannot protect themselves." The words sank deep. But as Zohran stepped outside into the cold night air, his phone buzzed again, an anonymous message: "Stop involving yourself. You don't know who you're dealing with." For the first time since that morning on the street, a chill ran deeper than the wind. Something larger was unfolding, and it was only beginning to show its face. The next morning dawned heavy and gray, as though the city itself carried the same unease that had gripped Zohran's heart since receiving that message. He barely slept. Every few minutes he replayed the warning in his mind: "You don't know who you're dealing with." The words didn't sound like a random threat, they sounded like a clue. Determined, he opened his laptop and began cross-referencing the children's first names through every missing persons report filed in the past 2 weeks. Hours passed, one database after another yielding nothing, until suddenly, a record appeared. Aisha Rahman, 32, reported missing 3 days ago. Her photo flashed across the screen, a woman with kind eyes, her hijab neatly pinned, holding the same 2 children now asleep on his couch. Zohran's pulse quickened. The report stated she was an immigrant recently evicted from her apartment after losing her job at a garment factory. The landlord had filed a complaint. Neighbors said they last saw her leaving with the children late at night. Yet what struck him was a red-stamped note at the bottom: "Case closed, presumed voluntary disappearance." Voluntary? No mother abandons her children voluntarily in freezing weather. Something didn't fit. He printed the document, grabbed his coat, and drove toward the listed address. The building was half collapsed, its windows boarded and walls tagged with graffiti. He asked around, and a woman sweeping the sidewalk pointed toward an alley. "She used to sleep near the old clinic," she said quietly. Then 2 men came asking questions. After that, she vanished. The alley was damp and littered with forgotten things, bottles, torn posters, the echo of desperation. On the ground near the clinic door, Zohran found a small silver bracelet with the name Aya etched in delicate letters. His chest tightened. This wasn't coincidence anymore, this was a trail. As he picked it up, a voice called behind him. "You shouldn't be here, Assemblyman." It was the same tall officer from the cafe. "This area is under investigation," he said curtly. "Investigation for what?" Zohran demanded. The officer hesitated, then lowered his gaze. Her employer was being questioned for labor violations. She might have been a witness. The realization hit like a wave: the missing mother wasn't just poor or unlucky. She might have been silenced. Driving back through the city, the lights blurred past his windshield. Every honk, every face outside the window seemed to merge into one question pulsing in his mind: what kind of justice forgets a woman for telling the truth? When he reached his office, the twins were still asleep under his coat. He placed the bracelet beside Aya's small hand. It shimmered faintly under the lamplight, like a fragile promise renewed. "I found a part of her," he whispered to himself. "And I won't stop until I find the rest." For the first time since the morning he met them, his compassion turned into determination, sharper, heavier, unstoppable. The story had ceased being an act of kindness. It had become a mission. By dawn, the calm of the office had vanished. A knock thundered at the door, 3 sharp raps that carried the impatience of authority. Zohran opened it to find 2 men in plain clothes flashing badges. "Detective Carver, NYPD. We're here for the children." His heart clenched. "Under whose order?" he asked, his tone measured but firm. "Protective custody," Carver replied. "We have reports of interference with an active investigation." The word interference echoed in his chest like an accusation. Behind him, Aya peeked out from the couch, clutching the silver bracelet. Zohran stepped sideways, shielding the twins with his body. "They're witnesses, not evidence," he said. The detectives exchanged glances, clearly unprepared for resistance from a state assemblyman. "Sir, this can get messy," one warned. "Then let it," Zohran replied. After several tense minutes, the men left, but not before muttering, "You'll regret this, Assemblyman." The door closed, leaving an uneasy silence. Zohran turned toward the twins, their eyes wide with fear. He forced a smile. "No one's taking you away," he said gently, though his voice trembled. Inside, he knew the walls were closing in. Whatever truth Aisha Rahman had uncovered before her disappearance, it was something powerful enough to scare the city's machinery into motion. He called Rashid for advice. The old baker arrived within minutes, bringing food and quiet strength. "When they can't stop truth, they try to frighten the one searching for it," Rashid murmured. "You've already chosen your path, my son. Now walk it to the end." Later that afternoon, a reporter named Lila Thompson, the same woman who had questioned him outside City Hall, arrived unexpectedly. "I want the real story," she said, setting her recorder on the desk. "Off the record, if you prefer." Zohran hesitated, then shared everything: the children, the missing mother, the threat, the factory connection. Lila listened without interruption, her expression growing graver by the minute. "I know that factory," she whispered finally. "They were accused of employing undocumented workers, most women, paid almost nothing. Aisha might have testified." Zohran exhaled slowly, realization dawning. "Then she didn't vanish," he said. "She was erased." Lila met his eyes. "If that's true, your next move will either save her or destroy your career." That night, as the city's hum softened into the rhythm of distant rain, Zohran stood by the window, watching droplets trace slow paths down the glass. Amir and Aya slept nearby, their breathing steady, their innocence untouched by the storm rising around them. He whispered a quiet prayer, not for protection, but for courage. In that moment, he understood that kindness without courage was merely comfort. To truly help, he would have to fight, not as a politician seeking approval, but as a human being unwilling to accept silence as justice. Lightning flared across the skyline, illuminating his reflection, weary, determined, and ready. Tomorrow, the fight would begin. The next morning came with a hollow stillness that felt unnatural, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Zohran arrived at his office early, a cup of tea in his hand and determination in his chest. He had planned to meet Lila to finalize their exposé about the factory's corruption. But when he opened the door, the world shifted. The couch was empty. The blankets, the toys, the small Quran on the table, gone. Panic exploded in his veins. "Aya?" "Amir," he shouted, running through the office, opening every door, every corner, knowing deep down what had already happened. His assistant, pale and trembling, entered moments later. "They came with papers," she whispered. "Child services, they said they were following court orders." The teacup slipped from his hand, shattering across the floor like the promise he'd made. He drove through the rain, the city blurring into streaks of gray, his mind a storm of disbelief. At the child services building, he demanded answers, but the woman at the front desk met him with the same indifferent tone that had haunted his entire fight. "Sir, the children are safe in temporary custody," she said. "You'll have to file a petition for visitation rights." Visitation rights? He wasn't their father, but in every way that mattered, he was. His voice cracked. "They're not case numbers," he said softly. "They're human beings who've already lost everything." The woman didn't meet his eyes. He turned away before his anger could turn into something worse. Outside, cameras flashed, reporters shouting, "Assemblyman Mamdani under investigation for obstruction." The truth had been twisted before it was even told. By evening, his name trended online, torn between praise and condemnation. Some called him a hero. Others demanded his resignation. In his apartment, the silence pressed against him like a living thing. On the table lay the only piece of evidence he still had, the bracelet engraved Aya. He turned it in his hand, remembering the weight of her trust, the warmth of her small fingers. It was unbearable to think that the very institutions meant to protect had now become instruments of separation. He sank into his chair, head in his hands, and whispered a prayer, not the composed kind recited in public, but the raw, desperate kind only the broken understand. Then his phone buzzed. A message. No name, just words glowing in the dark. If you want them back, find the truth about Aisha's employer, tonight. His heart pounded. This was no longer about politics or public service. This was personal, sacred. He stood, grabbed his coat, and walked into the rain. Each drop felt like a baptism into a new purpose, stripped of titles, shielded only by faith. For the first time since meeting the twins, he felt utterly alone, yet somehow closer to something divine. He didn't know if he could save them. But he knew one truth now burned too deep to deny. Sometimes, faith begins when hope runs out. Zohran drove through the midnight rain toward the industrial district, guided only by the cryptic message glowing on his phone. The streets were nearly empty, the kind of silence that only the guilty buy. The factory loomed ahead, a dark skeleton of metal and broken glass, its sign half-burned and unreadable. As he stepped out of the car, lightning flashed, revealing words still faintly visible on the gate, Rahman Textiles. His breath caught. Aisha's last name. The same company she had worked for. He slipped through a gap in the fence, boots splashing through puddles, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. Inside, the factory reeked of oil, dust, and neglect. But beneath the noise of dripping water, he heard something else, a faint voice calling, "Hello? Who's there?" It was Lila. The journalist emerged from the darkness, her coat soaked and face pale but determined. "I got the same message," she said. "Someone inside wanted us to see this." She pointed toward a file cabinet pried open with metal bars. Inside were folders marked payroll fraud, illegal deportations, and testimony, Rahman. Zohran's pulse thundered. Aisha had testified against her employers for exploiting undocumented women, but before her case could reach court, she vanished. Lila flipped through the documents, gasping. "Look at this," emails between the factory owner and a government contractor. They paid to have her deported, or worse. The pieces fell together with crushing clarity. The disappearance wasn't random, it was a silencing. And the people responsible still held power. Before they could speak further, footsteps echoed from the far end of the hall. A beam of light swept across the room. "Assemblyman Mamdani," a voice boomed. It was Detective Carver again, flanked by officers. "You need to leave. This is a restricted site." But Zohran saw the fear flicker in Carver's eyes, not anger, fear. "You knew," Zohran said quietly. "You knew what happened to her." The detective's jaw tightened. "You're digging where you shouldn't. And you're protecting those who shouldn't be protected," Zohran shot back. The standoff hung thick until Lila stepped forward, holding up her phone. "This conversation's being recorded and live-streamed." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Carver lowered his weapon and walked away into the dark, muttering, "You just made powerful enemies." By dawn, the world had already changed. Lila's footage spread online faster than fire through dry grass. Thousands shared it, the story of Aisha Rahman, the silenced worker, and the politician who refused to stay silent. News outlets picked it up. Protests began forming outside City Hall. And for the first time in days, Zohran allowed himself to breathe. He returned to his office, exhausted but alive. On his desk lay a sealed envelope, no return address, only 2 words written in Arabic, for the children. Inside were coordinates and a simple message, "They're safe." His eyes blurred with tears he no longer tried to hide. The war was not over, but the tide had turned. In his heart, faith had become something deeper, not belief in miracles, but belief in action born of love. The sun rose over Queens with a rare clarity, washing the city in gold. For the first time in weeks, the air felt lighter, yet Zohran knew it was only the calm before the storm. The revelation had shaken New York to its core, his name plastered across every headline, half calling him a hero, half branding him a radical. The truth about Aisha Rahman had ignited something larger than politics, a moral reckoning. Yet amidst all the noise, his thoughts stayed fixed on one thing, the twins. They were safe somewhere, hidden from those who had tried to erase their mother's story. But for how long? He stood at his office window, watching protesters gather below, holding signs that read "Justice for Aisha" and "Protect the Innocent." For the first time, the city's heartbeat matched his own. Lila arrived moments later, her phone buzzing nonstop. "They're scrambling," she said breathlessly. "The factory's CEO, the investors, even a few government names, everyone's denying involvement. But the files we found can't be buried anymore." She handed him a folder. "You have a hearing at noon. The committee wants answers about your conduct." Zohran smirked faintly. "They'll get them," he said, sliding the folder under his arm. "Every one of them." But behind that calm exterior, a quiet fear gnawed at him. He wasn't afraid of losing his seat, he was afraid of failing the children who had trusted him. Before leaving, he took the small bracelet from his pocket, the one engraved with Aya, and pressed it against his heart. "You brought me this far," he whispered. "Now guide me the rest of the way." At the courthouse steps, Rashid waited for him, surrounded by members of the community. The old baker's hands trembled slightly as he clasped Zohran's shoulder. "You're walking into fire, my son," he said. "But fire also purifies." Zohran nodded, his throat tight. "If I burn," he replied softly, "may it light someone else's way." Inside the courthouse, the air was thick with tension. Cameras flashed, politicians whispered, and the public gallery overflowed with people desperate to see justice unfold. He took his seat, feeling the weight of 1,000 eyes upon him. Across the room sat men in suits, the same faces from those factory documents. Their expressions were masks carved from arrogance and fear. As the hearing began, voices clashed, accusations, deflections, evasions. But when it was finally his turn to speak, Zohran rose slowly, the room falling silent. "This isn't about me," he began, his voice low yet unshakable. "This is about 2 children who believed their mother would come back. About a woman who told the truth and was made to disappear. And about a city that must decide what justice really means." His words resonated like an echo through the chamber. No theatrics, no anger, only truth. As he stepped down, he saw something shift in the faces around him. Some lowered their eyes in shame, others looked inspired. The tide was turning again, and the final confrontation, the one that would decide not just his fate, but theirs, was approaching fast. The courtroom had never felt so quiet. The walls seemed to absorb every breath, every heartbeat, as Zohran Mamdani stood before the committee that once praised him but now sought to bury him. Across the table sat the very men who had funded the factory, investors wrapped in expensive suits and indifference. Cameras clicked like the rhythm of judgment, and the air pulsed with anticipation. The chairman cleared his throat. "Assemblyman Mamdani," he began, "you stand accused of obstructing an active investigation and endangering minors. Do you have anything to say before this body makes its decision?" Zohran looked around the room, journalists, citizens, and even some of his political allies. Then, slowly, he rose. "I do," he said, his voice calm but burning with conviction. "You want to decide whether I broke the law. But maybe it's time we ask whose laws we've been following, the laws of justice or the laws of convenience." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A woman named Aisha Rahman tried to speak the truth about her employer, a company that enslaved the undocumented, silenced the poor, and treated faith like a weakness. For her courage, she was made to disappear. "When I found her children alone on a cold street, I didn't see minors. I saw humanity abandoned by the system we claim to protect." He paused, eyes steady. "If compassion is a crime, then I am guilty. And I will answer for it proudly." Lila, seated in the gallery, pressed record on her phone. Her camera captured not just a speech but a moment, the room transforming from sterile authority into a chamber of conscience. The chairman shifted uncomfortably. "These are serious accusations," he said. "You're implicating government partners." "No," Zohran replied. "They implicated themselves when they placed profit above mercy." He reached into his folder and placed a series of documents on the table, the signed contracts, the deleted payroll lists, the hidden testimonies. Gasps filled the room as the evidence spilled across the polished wood like truth finally unchained. "This," Zohran said softly, "is what you tried to bury." Then, the doors burst open. Detective Carver entered, his expression hard but changed, the kind of face worn by someone who'd spent the night choosing between silence and redemption. "Chairman," he said loudly, "I have a sworn statement. The children were taken under false pretenses. Their mother is alive, in protective custody." She feared retaliation. A stunned silence filled the hall. Zohran's eyes widened. Alive. Aisha was alive. For a long moment, he couldn't breathe. The chairman turned pale, fumbling with his papers as reporters surged forward. The truth, once a whisper, now roared. As security escorted the corrupt officials out, Zohran stood motionless, his heart caught between relief and disbelief. In the chaos, he caught Lila's gaze, and for the first time since that morning on the street, he smiled. The storm had broken. Outside the courthouse, the sky broke open into sunlight, the kind that feels like forgiveness. Reporters shouted questions, microphones thrust forward, but for once, Zohran didn't hear them. His eyes were fixed on the figure stepping from the car escorted by officers, a woman in a soft gray hijab, her face pale but peaceful. Aisha Rahman. She looked thinner than in her photo, her hands trembling slightly as she scanned the crowd. And then, through the chaos, two small voices cried out, "Mama!" Aya and Amir sprinted from the crowd before anyone could stop them. The moment they collided, mother and children, the world seemed to stop. Cameras lowered. Even the reporters went silent. Aisha fell to her knees, holding them so tightly it looked as if she feared they might vanish again. Tears streaked her face as she whispered, "I told you I'd come back." Zohran stood at a distance, unable to move. Every sleepless night, every doubt, every moment of fear, all of it converged into this single instant. When Aisha lifted her gaze toward him, gratitude filled her eyes. She approached, still clutching the twins, and said softly, "I don't have words, only prayers." Zohran smiled faintly. "Then let them speak louder than mine." Around them, the crowd began to clap, not for politics or victory, but for something far rarer, humanity restored. Lila wiped tears from her face as she recorded the reunion, knowing that no headline could ever capture what that moment truly meant. For once, compassion had outshouted power. Days later, the assembly issued its ruling. The corrupt officials were suspended, and a formal inquiry into forced labor networks began. Zohran declined interviews and refused to turn the event into political capital. Instead, he spent quiet evenings at the community center, helping families facing eviction, visiting mosques, and reminding himself why he had entered public service in the first place. Rashid still brought him samosas each morning, though now with a knowing smile. "You carried more than law in your hands, my son," he said. "You carried mercy." Zohran would simply nod, his eyes distant, thinking of two children laughing somewhere safe again. On a quiet Sunday morning, he walked along the same street where it had all begun. The bench where the twins once sat was empty, but not forgotten. He placed a small bouquet there, nothing extravagant, just lilies and jasmine. As the wind brushed against his face, he whispered, "You were never abandoned. Not by her. Not by faith. Not by this city." The distant sound of the adhan floated through the air, soft and reassuring. He closed his eyes, letting its melody settle deep in his chest. For the first time in a long time, he felt peace. Not because the world had changed overnight, but because he had learned something eternal, that true faith is not in believing miracles happen, but in becoming one. If you made it this far, subscribe, leave your like, and tell us where you're watching from. Thank you, and see you next time.